I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the sold sign still standing in my front yard, tilted slightly in the ocean wind like it didn't belong there anymore, like it was waiting for someone to question it. And the smell of salt and sun-warmed would hit me the second I stepped out of my truck, the same smell I grew up with, the same smell that used to mean home. Except now there was a black SUV parked in my driveway, and voices coming from inside the house that my father built with his own hands, voices that didn't recognize me, voices that laughed like they owned the place. And for a second I just stood there with my keys still in my hand, listening to the distant crash of waves about 100 yards out and the low hum of the wind pushing against the dunes, trying to convince myself I had the wrong address. Except I didn't, because I knew every inch of that property, every warped plank on the porch, every nail that creaked when you stepped just a little too far to the left. And then the front door opened and a man I had never seen before walked out holding a coffee mug like he had been living there for years, like this was just another quiet morning on his beach. And he looked at me the same way you look at a stranger who's parked where they shouldn't be, confused but already a little irritated. And that's when I noticed the new lock on the door behind him, polished steel catching the sunlight. Not the old brass handle my dad installed back in '94, and something cold settled in my chest as I glanced back at that sign again. The bold red letters, sold, still staked into sand that legally, unquestionably, undeniably belonged to me. And I remember thinking this had to be a mistake, some paperwork mix-up, something small that could be fixed with a phone call. But then he said, "Can I help you?" And there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just ownership. And that's when I felt it, that shift, that quiet realization that whatever had happened here wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, planned, signed off, approved, and executed while I was gone, while I trusted that the place would still be here waiting for me, just like it always had. And the wind picked up just enough to rattle the sign again. That soft, hollow tapping sound against the wooden post echoing louder than it should have. And I took a slow breath, tasting salt in the air, grounding myself the way my father taught me when things didn't make sense, when emotions started to outrun logic. Because if there's one thing he drilled into me standing on that same porch years ago, watching storms roll in over the Atlantic, it was this: you don't react, you observe, you understand, and then you act. And as I looked past that stranger into the living room where my father's old chair still sat by the window, exactly where he left it, I realized something else, something they hadn't counted on, something buried deep in paperwork older than that sign, older than this entire neighborhood, something that meant this wasn't just my house, and whatever the HOA thought they had sold, whatever assumption they had made about me being gone, about this place being abandoned, about no one coming back to claim it, was about to cost them more than they could possibly imagine. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and that stretch of coastline was never just a vacation spot to me. It was the one place in the world where everything made sense, where the noise of cities and contracts and deadlines faded into the steady rhythm of waves hitting sand. The same rhythm I grew up falling asleep to every summer, back when my father still had the strength to haul lumber across the dunes and build that house piece by piece with his own hands, measuring twice, cutting once, the smell of fresh pine mixing with salt air as he worked from sunrise to sunset like the ocean itself was keeping time for him. And I was just a kid then, barefoot in the sand, handing him tools I could barely lift, learning without realizing it that this place was more than wood and nails. It was a promise, something he intended to last longer than either of us. And when he passed, that promise became mine whether I was ready for it or not, which is probably why I never sold it, even when offers started coming in, numbers that would make most people sign without thinking twice, developers circling like gulls, talking about resorts and private docks and exclusive memberships. But they never understood what they were looking at. They saw beachfront property measured in square feet. I saw a lifetime measured in moments. The exact spot where my father taught me how to read the tide by watching how the foam pulled back. The corner of the porch where he used to sit every evening with a cup of black coffee, saying that the ocean does not belong to anyone, but the land beside it carries stories, and you do not give those away lightly. And even after I left for work, took contracts up and down the coast, engineering shoreline protections, and studying erosion patterns for projects that paid well, but kept me away for months at a time, I kept this place untouched, maintained just enough to keep it standing, trusting that the system, the laws, The paperwork filed decades ago would protect it while I was gone, because everything about this property had been done right. Permits filed, surveys completed, boundaries marked with precision down to the inch. And I remember my father once tapping a stack of documents on the kitchen table, telling me in that quiet, steady voice of his that most people think ownership is about having the keys, but real ownership lives in the details no one bothers to read, the kind that sit in county records for years waiting for the moment someone finally needs them, and standing there now, looking at strangers moving through rooms that still held our furniture. Hearing their footsteps echo across floors I helped sand down as a teenager, I realized just how badly someone had misread those details. Because if there is one thing I learned from my father and every mile of coastline I have ever studied, it is that boundaries matter, and when you ignore them, the consequences do not come all at once. They build quietly, steadily, like pressure behind a rising tide, until the moment they break everything in their path. Victoria Hale did not introduce herself the way most people do. She arrived like she already owned the air around her, stepping out of a white luxury SUV that rolled to a quiet stop just short of my driveway, the engine humming low like it did not want to disturb the image she carried with her. And even before she said a word, I could smell her perfume cutting through the salt air, sharp and expensive, the kind of scent that lingers longer than it should, and she walked toward me with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, heels sinking slightly into the sand, but never slowing her down, like she had done this 100 times before and expected the ground to adjust to her, not the other way around. And when she spoke my name, it was not a question. It was a confirmation, like she had already read the file, already decided who I was supposed to be in this situation. Mr. Caldwell, I assume, she said, tilting her head just enough to make it feel polite while still staying in control. And behind her, I could see two other neighbors watching from a distance, arms crossed, pretending not to listen while catching every word. And that was the first thing I noticed about this place. It was not just a neighborhood. It was a system, one that moved quietly but deliberately, one that watched everything and responded fast when something did not fit its version of order. And Victoria was clearly at the center of it, the kind of person who turned rules into leverage and paperwork into weapons without ever raising her voice. And she explained it all in that calm, almost reassuring tone, how the property had been flagged as abandoned after months of inactivity, how notices had been sent, how the association had followed proper procedure to maintain community standards, each word carefully chosen, polished, rehearsed, like she had said this exact speech before and never once been challenged on it. And as she spoke, I could hear the faint clink of dishes from inside my house, someone setting a cup down on a counter that used to belong to my father. And it hit me then. This was not just about one house. This was about control, about reshaping the coastline into something predictable and profitable, something that fit neatly into brochures and property value charts. And people like me, people who held on to land for reasons that could not be measured in dollars, did not fit into that system. So they rewrote the situation until we disappeared from it. And Victoria kept talking, mentioning committees and approvals and timelines, layering authority over authority until it sounded airtight, until it sounded official enough that most people would stop questioning it right there. But I did not interrupt her. I just listened, watching the way she held her clipboard like it was a badge, the way her voice stayed steady even when the wind picked up and pushed strands of her hair across her face. Because I had seen this before, not in neighborhoods but in boardrooms and project meetings. People who believed that if they controlled the narrative long enough, reality would eventually follow. And when she finally paused, giving me space to respond, I could see it in her expression, that small flicker of expectation, like she was waiting for confusion, maybe even compliance. And that was when I understood exactly what kind of mistake she had made, not in the paperwork, not in the process, but in the assumption that I was just another name on a file, another absent owner who would accept what had been decided in his place, because the ocean behind us kept moving, steady and patient, and I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous shifts are the ones you do not notice until it is too late. I let her finish every word without interrupting, even when the details stopped making sense, even when the timeline she described felt too clean, too convenient, like a story that had been polished until it no longer reflected reality. And when she finally handed me a copy of the documents clipped neatly to that board, the paper felt heavier than it should have, thick, Expensive stock that smelled faintly of fresh ink and printer heat, and I could hear the ocean behind me growing louder as the tide pushed in, a low, steady roar that filled the spaces between her sentences, and I started reading, slowly, line by line, because rushing is how people miss things, how they accept what is put in front of them without questioning what is missing. And at first glance it looked legitimate. Notices issued, timelines observed, signatures in place, everything arranged in a way that suggested authority. But the more I looked, the more the edges started to show, dates that lined up a little too perfectly, language that leaned heavily on interpretation instead of fact, and one phrase that caught my attention immediately, subject to association jurisdiction, printed in clean, confident type like it had always been true. And I felt that same cold clarity settle in again, the kind that replaces anger with focus, because that phrase alone told me everything I needed to know about how this had happened. They had not taken the property by force. They had taken it by assumption, by building a narrative strong enough that no one thought to question the foundation underneath it. And I glanced up from the page to the house, to the windows reflecting sunlight in a way that made it almost impossible to see inside. And for a moment I could picture my father standing there, arms crossed, looking out at the water the same way he always did, calm, patient, never rushing to react. And I remembered something else he used to say when storms rolled in faster than expected, that the worst damage does not come from the wind itself, it comes from what people do when they panic, when they try to fix things too quickly without understanding what is actually happening. And Victoria was still watching me, waiting for a response, her posture relaxed but deliberate, like she had already accounted for every possible reaction I might have. And I realized that was exactly what she expected, a reaction, something emotional, something she could redirect back into the system she controlled. But instead I handed the papers back to her without a word and took a slow step toward the edge of the property, my boots sinking slightly into the sand where the grass gave way to open shoreline, and I looked down at the boundary markers that most people would not even notice, small, weathered stakes set years ago that had shifted just enough with the wind and tides to blend into the landscape, but not enough to disappear. And I crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of sand with my hand until the metal cap beneath it caught the light, and I could feel Victoria's attention shift behind me. That subtle change in silence, when someone realizes the conversation is moving in a direction they did not plan for. And I stood up slowly, turning back toward her with the ocean stretching out behind me, endless and steady. And for the first time since I arrived I spoke, keeping my voice even, controlled, the way I had learned to do in rooms where the smallest detail could change everything. Because this was no longer about what they thought they had done, it was about what they had overlooked, and the difference between those two things was about to matter more than anything written on that paper. I pointed down toward the marker without raising my voice, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it, and said, "You see that?" And for the first time since she arrived, Victoria did not answer immediately. She followed my gaze instead, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was trying to decide whether this was relevant or just a distraction, and that hesitation told me more than anything else. Because people who are certain do not pause like that. They correct you. They redirect. They stay in control. But she was calculating now, adjusting, and I could hear the wind shifting behind us, carrying the distant sound of gulls and the steady crash of waves that never stopped, never rushed, just kept coming in on their own time. And I took a step back from the edge of the sand, giving her space to move closer if she wanted, not forcing it, because forcing things is how you lose leverage. And sure enough, she stepped forward, careful with her footing this time, looking down at the marker like it might confirm what she already believed. And I watched the moment she realized it was not where she expected it to be, just a slight change in her posture, a tightening around her eyes, small enough that most people would miss it, but not me, because I had spent years reading coastlines the same way, watching for shifts that seemed insignificant until they changed everything. And she straightened up quickly, recovering that composed expression like nothing had happened. Clipboard still held firmly against her side, and she said something about boundary discrepancies being common in coastal areas, that surveys could be outdated, that the association had conducted its own assessment, all of it delivered in that same polished tone. But now there was a thread of uncertainty underneath it, thin but there, and I nodded slowly as if I was considering her explanation. even though I already knew exactly where this was going, because the problem with assumptions is not that they are always wrong. It is that they are built on incomplete information, and once you start stacking decisions on top of them, the entire structure depends on something that was never verified in the first place. And I could see it happening in real time now. The way her confidence was adjusting to account for something she had not planned for, and behind her the man from the house had stepped out onto the porch, watching us with that same confused irritation, like he was waiting for someone to explain why this conversation was taking so long. And I realized then that he was part of this too, not intentionally, but inevitably, because when systems fail, they do not just affect the people who built them, they pull everyone involved into the consequences. And I turned back toward Victoria, keeping my voice steady, measured, the way you speak when you want someone to listen instead of react. And I said, you sold something based on jurisdiction you assumed you had. And I let that sit for a second before adding, but this line right here says otherwise. And I gestured again toward the marker, not aggressively, just enough to anchor the point in something physical, something real. And for the first time her smile did not come back immediately. It flickered, just for a moment, like a signal cutting out. And that was when I knew this was no longer a simple conversation. It was the beginning of something much bigger, because once doubt enters a system built on certainty, it does not stay contained. It spreads, slowly at first, then all at once, until everything that depended on it starts to unravel. I could feel the shift settle in around us like the tide changing direction, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you knew what to look for. And Victoria adjusted her stance just enough to regain that sense of control she relied on, lifting the clipboard slightly, as if the weight of it alone could anchor the situation back in her favor. And she began speaking again, this time more precise, more deliberate, referencing internal surveys, compliance reviews, community authority, layering. Terms that sounded official enough to drown out doubt. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was reinforcing something rather than verifying it, repeating conclusions instead of examining foundations. And I let her continue without interruption, because this was exactly what I needed. The more she committed to that version of reality, the harder it would be for her to step away from it later. And the wind picked up again, carrying grains of sand across the surface of the property in thin, shifting lines that blurred the edges of everything just enough to remind me how temporary appearances can be. And I glanced once more at the marker, then back at the house, at the clean lines of the structure that had stood through storms, through seasons, through years of change without ever losing its place. And I remembered standing in the county office years ago with my father, watching him review documents line by line with a patience that felt excessive at the time, until he explained that land near water is never simple, that there are layers beneath the surface, protections and restrictions that most people overlook because they do not need them until it is too late. And that memory clicked into place now with a clarity that cut through everything Victoria was saying, because this was not just about a boundary line. It was about jurisdiction that extended beyond what her association could control, something older, something filed long before her position existed. And I turned slightly toward the shoreline, letting my eyes follow the natural curve of the coast where the sand met the water, because that line, that shifting edge, was exactly where the distinction lived, not visible to most, but recorded in ways that did not change just because someone decided to redraw a map. And I could see her watching me again, trying to read what I was thinking, trying to anticipate my next move. And that was when I understood the real advantage I had in this moment. It was not the documents themselves, not yet. It was time, because she believed this conversation would end here, that whatever disagreement existed could be managed, contained, processed through the same system that created it. But I had no intention of resolving anything today, not when the structure she built was still standing, not when the assumptions she made were still intact. Because the strongest way to expose a flaw is not to point it out too early. It is to let it carry weight until it can no longer support itself. And I took a slow breath, tasting the salt in the air again, grounding myself in the same rhythm I had known my entire life. And I nodded once, calmly, as if I was accepting what she said, as if this was simply a matter of interpretation that could be sorted out later. And I stepped back from the marker, giving the appearance of retreat, even offering a slight, measured acknowledgement, because sometimes the most effective move is not to push, It is to step away and let the other side believe they have already won. And as I turned toward my truck, I could feel her attention. Follow me, cautious now, no longer entirely certain, and behind us the ocean kept moving, steady and patient, building pressure in ways that no one notices until the moment everything changes. I did not drive far, just enough to get out of sight of the house and the carefully maintained illusion wrapped around it. Pulling over at a stretch of shoulder where the dunes rose higher and the sound of the ocean carried cleaner, less filtered by structures and expectations, and I sat there for a moment with the engine off, listening to the wind move through the grass in long, steady waves, the same pattern I had studied for years in my work, the same pattern that revealed changes long before they became visible to anyone else. And I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the old folder I always kept with me, worn at the edges, the paper inside slightly yellowed from time, but still intact, still precise. Because my father never trusted memory alone when it came to land. He trusted records, and as I flipped through the pages I could feel the weight of those details again. Survey maps drawn with exact measurements down to fractions of an inch, notes referencing coastal protection zones, and one document in particular that I had not needed in years, a federal easement agreement tied directly to shoreline stability, stamped and filed decades ago, when this entire stretch of coast was evaluated for erosion risk. And I remembered sitting in that same county office as a teenager, bored and restless, while my father insisted I pay attention, explaining that properties like ours did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger system that most people ignored because it did not affect them until it did, and I ran my finger along the line on the map that marked the boundary of that easement, tracing it from the waterline inward, past the exact point where the marker I had uncovered earlier was placed, and I let out a slow breath as everything aligned, not in a sudden revelation, but in a quiet confirmation of what I already suspected, because that line did not just define ownership, it defined jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is where authority either exists or it does not. There is no assumption there, no interpretation that changes it, and I leaned back in the seat, letting the realization settle without rushing it, because rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what I needed the other side to keep making. And I thought about Victoria's certainty, the way she had built her position on procedures that only worked within the boundaries she believed she controlled, and I understood now that her entire system depended on that belief being correct, that no one would challenge it at a deeper level, that no one would go back far enough in the records to see what existed before her authority was ever established. And I closed the folder carefully, not with urgency, but with intention, because this was not the moment to act. This was the moment to prepare, to let the situation develop exactly as it had been set in motion, to allow every document they had filed, every transaction they had completed, to stand as it was, unchallenged for just a little longer, because the more complete their position became, the more irreversible it would feel to them, and the harder the impact would be when the foundation underneath it gave way, and I started the engine again, the low rumble grounding me back in the present, and as I pulled away from that stretch of road, I could still see the roofline of the house in the distance, steady against the horizon, exactly where it had always been, and I knew that nothing about its position had changed, only the assumptions surrounding it, and assumptions, no matter how confident, do not hold when they meet something built on fact. I did not go home that night. Instead, I drove straight to the county records office the next morning, the kind of place most people only visit when they absolutely have to. Quiet, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the faint smell of paper and dust hanging in the air like time itself had slowed down inside those walls. And I signed in, nodded to the clerk who barely looked up, and made my way to the back where the older records were kept, because anything recent would only tell part of the story, and I needed the part that no one had bothered to revisit in years. And as I pulled open one of the metal drawers, the soft scrape of steel against steel echoed just enough to remind me how many documents had passed through here unnoticed, how many decisions had been made based on surface-level understanding without anyone ever digging deeper. And I started with the parcel records, tracing the chain of ownership back through decades, confirming what I already knew, that the property had never changed hands outside of my family, no gaps, no transfers, nothing that could legally justify what had happened. But that was not where the real answer lived, and I moved on to zoning overlays, flipping through large format maps that unfolded across the table with a dry, papery sound, each one layered with lines and codes that most people would not recognize. And there it was again, that same designation I had seen in my father's folder, a coastal protection buffer, federally recognized. Not just a local guideline, but a jurisdictional boundary that overrode anything the association could claim, and I leaned in closer, reading the notes attached to it. Language that left no room for interpretation, restrictions on development, limitations on transfer, and most importantly, a clause that tied ownership rights directly to compliance with federal oversight, meaning any sale, any modification, any claim made without acknowledging that layer was not just incorrect, it was invalid. And I felt that quiet certainty settle in deeper now, not as a reaction, but as confirmation. Because this was not something that could be argued away with procedure or internal policy. This was something recorded at a level that did not change. Based on who was in charge of a neighborhood association, and I requested copies. Watching the clerk stamp each page with that firm, mechanical precision, the sound sharp and final, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had been waiting years to be completed. And as I gathered the documents into a new folder, cleaner, more current, I could not help but notice how simple it all looked when laid out correctly. How obvious the distinction was once you knew where to look. And that was the part most people never reached, because they stopped at the first explanation that sounded official, the first answer that came with confidence, and I stepped outside into the sunlight again, the air warmer now, carrying the distant scent of the ocean even this far inland, and I paused for a moment, letting the noise of the world return around me, cars passing, voices in the distance, everything moving as if nothing had changed, even though I knew it had, because now I was not just standing on memory or assumption, I was standing on something documented, something enforceable, something that did not bend to convenience. And as I walked back to my truck, folder in hand, I understood that what happened at the house was not the end of the situation, it was only the beginning. Because systems built on incorrect assumptions do not fail immediately, they hold just long enough to feel secure, and then they collapse all at once when confronted with something they cannot override. I did not call anyone right away, not even a lawyer, because bringing people in too early turns a situation into a fight before it has fully revealed itself, and I had learned the hard way that timing matters more than urgency. So instead I made one call that afternoon to someone who understood land the way I did, someone who did not react to headlines or assumptions but to facts, Daniel Mercer. A surveyor who had spent over 30 years mapping coastal properties up and down the state. The kind of man who trusted measurements over opinions and carried that quiet confidence that only comes from being right more often than not. And when he answered, I could hear the faint background noise of equipment and wind, like he was already out in the field. And I kept it simple, gave him the location, told him what I had found. And there was a pause on the other end, not confusion, just recognition, and he said, you are going to want a fresh survey on that, full boundary verification, not just for you, for the record. And that was all I needed, because when someone like Daniel tells you something is worth documenting, it means there is more beneath the surface than most people are seeing. And we agreed to meet the next morning, and I drove back toward the coast as the sun started dropping lower, casting long shadows across the dunes, the kind that stretch everything just enough to distort perception. And by the time I reached the property again, the lights were on inside the house, warm and steady, like nothing was wrong, like everything had already been settled. And I parked a little further down this time, not out of hesitation but out of observation, because distance changes perspective, and from there I could see the full layout, the position of the house relative to the shoreline, the slight elevation that most people would not think twice about, but that mattered when you understood erosion patterns. And I noticed something else too, something small but consistent, the way the neighboring properties were aligned just slightly differently, as if they had been adjusted to fit a boundary that did not actually include mine, and I let that sit for a moment, letting the pattern form instead of forcing it, because patterns reveal intent, and intent is what turns mistakes into liability. And I could see movement inside again, silhouettes crossing windows, people living their evening like they belonged there. And I felt no anger, no urgency to confront it, just a steady awareness that every hour they remained, every action they took under the assumption that everything was legitimate, added weight to what was already building beneath them. And I leaned back against the truck, listening to the wind carry the sound of the ocean across the darkening shoreline, steady, relentless, And I thought about what would happen when all of this came together, not as a confrontation, but as a correction, because that is what this was, not revenge, not even conflict, just the inevitable result of a system running into something it could not override. And I knew that by this time tomorrow, with a new survey in hand and the right people looking at the right documents, the first cracks would stop being theoretical and start becoming visible, not just to me, but to everyone involved. And once that happened, there would be no going back to the version of reality they were standing in now. Daniel was already there when I pulled up the next morning, his truck parked off to the side. With the tailgate down, equipment laid out in careful order like he had been working before the sun even cleared the horizon. And the air was cool, carrying that early coastal chill that disappears within an hour but leaves everything sharper, more defined. And he nodded when he saw me, not wasting time on small talk, just gesturing toward the property with a quiet, "Let us take a look." And we walked the line together, step by step, the soft crunch of sand under our boots the only sound between us at first, because people who understand land do not rush to conclusions. They observe, they measure, they confirm, and he set up his instruments with practiced precision, checking angles, distances, points that most people would walk right past without noticing. And I watched the way he worked, methodical, patient, verifying each marker against his data, and it did not take long before I saw the same thing I had seen. That slight misalignment, that boundary that did not follow the assumptions laid out by the association, and Daniel let out a low breath, not surprised, just acknowledging what was already there. And he said, "This is outside their jurisdiction." Simple, direct, no hesitation. And those words carried more weight than anything Victoria had said the day before, because they were based on measurement, not narrative, and we continued along the edge, confirming it again and again from different points, until there was no room left for interpretation, and I could feel that quiet certainty solidifying into something actionable, something that could not be brushed aside or explained away. And as we finished, Daniel packed his equipment back into the truck, moving with the same steady rhythm he had started with. And he handed me a preliminary printout, lines and coordinates mapped clearly, each one reinforcing what I already knew, and he said, "I will finalize this, but you are going to want this on record immediately." And I nodded, understanding exactly what that meant, because once something like this is formally recorded, it does not stay contained, it moves through systems, it triggers reviews, it forces attention where there was none before, and I thanked him, watching as he drove off, leaving me standing there with the morning light now fully settled across the property, illuminating everything in a way that made it look almost unchanged, almost peaceful. And I turned back toward the house, where movement had already started again inside, the new occupants going about their day like any other, unaware of how quickly the ground beneath their situation was shifting. And I took a slow breath, steadying myself, not from doubt, but from clarity, because this was the point where preparation became action, not loud, not immediate, but precise. And I reached for my phone, not to argue, not to confront, but to initiate the process that would bring all of this into the open, because once the right records were filed, once the right authorities were notified, this would no longer be a private disagreement. It would become a matter of fact, and facts, unlike assumptions, do not bend to convenience. They do not adjust to fit expectations. They remain exactly what they are until everything else is forced to realign around them. By the time I made the calls, the process moved faster than most people expect, not because anything was rushed, but because the right information had finally reached the right places, and systems that seemed slow from the outside tend to respond quickly once something crosses a certain threshold. And I could hear it in the tone of the county clerk when I referenced the easement and the updated survey. That subtle shift from routine processing to focused attention, and within hours the documents were flagged, reviewed, and escalated beyond the local level. Because federal jurisdiction is not something that stays buried once it is properly identified. It moves upward, outward, pulling an oversight that does not answer to neighborhood associations or internal committees, and I did not need to be present for most of it. I let the process unfold the way it was designed to, each step building on verified information instead of assumption, and by late afternoon I was back near the property again, not approaching it directly, just close enough to observe, and the atmosphere had already changed in a way that was hard to describe but impossible to miss. There were unfamiliar vehicles parked along the edge of the road, not disruptive, not dramatic, just present, and that presence alone was enough to alter the rhythm of everything around it. And I watched as Victoria arrived again, her SUV pulling in with the same controlled precision as before, but this time she stepped out, with a different energy, still composed, but sharper, more alert, like she had been pulled into a conversation she did not initiate, and I could see the moment she noticed the others, the slight pause, the quick adjustment in posture, and she moved toward them with that same practiced confidence. But now it was being tested against something that did not respond the way she expected, and I stayed where I was, leaning against my truck, letting distance give me clarity, because this was not a confrontation anymore. It was a correction taking shape in real time, and I could see the man from the house step outside again, confusion written more clearly on his face now, looking between the people gathered and the property he believed he owned. And that was when the weight of the situation fully settled into place, not as tension, but as inevitability, because once authority shifts, everything connected to it has to adjust. And I knew that what came next would not be loud or dramatic, it would be procedural, precise, and final, the kind of outcome that leaves no room for interpretation. And as the ocean continued its steady rhythm behind all of it, unchanged and indifferent to the systems built along its edge, I realized that the assumption this entire situation was built on had finally met something it could not absorb, something it could not rewrite, and from this point forward, every step would move in one direction only, toward a resolution that had already been determined the moment the truth was put on record. Nothing happened all at once, and that was the part most people misunderstand about situations like this. They expect a dramatic moment, a clear line where everything shifts. But what I saw instead was a series of small, precise adjustments that carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. And from where I stood, I could see the conversation unfolding near the edge of the property, voices low, controlled, documents being reviewed, compared, verified, and Victoria remained composed through all of it. But the difference now was not in how she acted, it was in how she was being received. Because the authority she relied on no longer held the same weight in that space, and I watched as one of the officials pointed toward the shoreline, tracing a line that was not visible to most people but had now been confirmed in every record that mattered. And there was a pause then, not long, just enough for everything to settle into place, and I could see the realization move through the group, not as surprise, but as recognition, because once something is established at that level, there is no argument left to make. Only actions to follow, and the man who had been staying in the house stepped closer, asking questions that did not have the answers he expected, his posture shifting from confidence to uncertainty as the explanation unfolded in terms that were clear, direct, and final. And I felt a quiet understanding for him in that moment, because he had not built this situation, he had stepped into it believing it was solid, the same way most people trust the systems they are presented with, and that trust had just been corrected, not by force, but by fact. And Victoria remained still for a moment longer, listening, processing, her expression controlled but no longer anchored in certainty. And when she finally responded, it was measured, careful, as if she was recalculating in real time. But the space around her had already shifted beyond her influence, because this was no longer contained within her structure. It had moved into one that did not bend to internal rules or negotiated outcomes. And I stayed where I was, letting the process complete itself without stepping in, because there was nothing to add, nothing to argue. Everything that needed to be said was already present in the documents, in the measurements, in the alignment between what existed physically and what had been recorded long before any of this began. And as the group slowly dispersed, the movement was calm, deliberate, but final, the kind of ending that does not need to announce itself to be understood. And I pushed myself off the side of the truck and took a few steps forward, not toward anyone in particular, just closer to the place that had never actually changed, and the ocean continued its steady rhythm behind it all, unchanged by the situation, indifferent to the assumptions that had come and gone. And I realized then that this was how it was always going to end, not with a confrontation, not with raised voices, but with everything returning to what it had always been, once the noise built around it was finally cleared away. I waited until the last of the vehicles had pulled away and the quiet returned to what it had always been. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that carries weight, the steady rhythm of waves meeting the shore, the wind moving across the dunes in long, patient breaths, and I walked back toward the house without urgency, each step sinking slightly into the sand in the same places it had years ago. Like the land itself had never acknowledged the interruption, and when I reached the porch, the wood creaked under my weight in that familiar way, one board just slightly looser than the others, a sound I could have recognized anywhere, and I paused there for a moment, hand resting against the frame of the door, feeling the texture of it, worn smooth in places where my father used to lean after long days, and the lock was no longer new, no longer out of place, just another detail that had already been corrected, and I stepped inside, the air carrying that faint mix of salt and old wood that had never changed, and everything was exactly where it had always been, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened had never truly altered what mattered, and I moved through the room slowly, not inspecting, not reclaiming, just acknowledging. The chair by the window, the view stretching out beyond it, the same horizon my father used to watch in silence, and I sat down for a moment, letting that view settle in, the light shifting across the water in a way that made time feel less rigid, less defined by everything that had just taken place, and I thought about how easily all of it could have gone differently, how close this place had come to being reduced to a transaction, a line item in a system that never understood what it was handling, and yet in the end, it was not force or confrontation that resolved it. It was something quieter, something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized, and I stood again, stepping out onto the back side of the house where the sand stretched uninterrupted toward the water, the boundary invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, and I could still see the marker I had uncovered earlier, now clear, defined, no longer buried beneath assumption, and I realized that was the only real difference between then and now, not the land itself, not the house, but the clarity of where things actually stood, and as the sun dipped lower, casting that same golden light across the shoreline, I felt a sense of completion that did not need to be announced or explained, because this was never about proving anything to anyone else. It was about understanding something fully and letting that understanding do the work it was always going to do, and I turned back toward the house one last time, the structure steady against the horizon, exactly where it belonged, and I knew that whatever systems tried to shape it, to claim it, to redefine it, would always face the same outcome, because ownership, real ownership, is not something you declare, it is something that holds, quietly, patiently, until the moment it needs to be seen, and when it is, everything else falls away exactly as it should.